Howdy folks, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Kind of good news, bad news situation. Yay, Mingles with Jingles. Boo, the weekend's over. So, glass half full, glass half empty. Depends how you look at it. It's good news for Fallout 76 though. Well, there isn't any bad news for Fallout 76 this week, which if you're Bethesda is very, very good news. So, congratulations Bethesda, well done. Let's see if you can make it 2 weeks in a row. Yeah, I'm not holding my breath. We all know it's only a matter of time. Well, anyway, what else is new this week? I got hit by a whole bunch of completely bullshit copyright claims, and I am definitely not alone. The culprit this time around being a bunch of scumbags going by the name of Illustrated Sound Music. The number of bogus copyright claims originating from these clown shoes in the space of the last week by now must number in the tens of thousands. And when I say bullshit copyright claims, I'm not exaggerating. Some of the videos that I had claimed included Horizon Zero Dawn, Ghost Recon Wildlands. Yes, it's been a very long time since I did a Ghost Recon Wildlands video. And when I actually investigated to see exactly what it was that I had plagiarized in my Ghost Recon Wildlands videos, because when you get one of these automatically generated copyright notices from YouTube, it directs you to the exact specific part of the video which is generating the claim. And I was astonished and not amused to discover that the music that was being claimed was playing in a part of the video where there wasn't actually any music playing. Yes, that's right. Illustrated Sound Music were claiming music that wasn't actually being played. So understandably, I filed a whole bunch of copyright disputes because I clearly have absolutely nothing better to do with my time than contest all of these bullshit claims. And I'm not alone. Thousands of people have been hit by these asshats. Most notably, at least in my experience so far, and definitely most amusingly, although not for him, games developer American McGee, who found that while doing Let's Play videos on YouTube of his own fucking games, Illustrated Sound Music were claiming copyright on them. These asshats have since issued a statement claiming that it is the fault of a bug in their algorithm, which is generating thousands upon thousands of spurious copyright claims, and have promised to relinquish all of the claims. They released this statement. Ooh, let me check the time. 5 days ago. I'm still waiting for them to release their claims. Now, if you were a suspicious, cynical-minded old bastard, you might suspect that these cockgoblets were waiting just to see how many people actually bothered to file disputes on all of their bullshit copyright claims, and then go ahead and release only the claims that have been disputed and let the tens of thousands of others ride so that they can continue to make money from them. You see, the uneducated amongst us might naturally assume that if it's so incredibly easy to file tens of thousands of copyright claims on stuff that you don't actually hold copyright for in the space of a single day, it should be just as easy to release all of those claims. You might also think that when confronted with a copyright scandal of this magnitude, a scandal where the offending parties have gone on public record as admitting responsibility and wrongdoing, that YouTube themselves might actually have something to say about this whole thing. A normal person could be completely forgiven for thinking that both of those things would be true, and a normal person would be absolutely 100% wrong. If YouTube have even noticed that their content creators are getting fucked over once again, they are far too busy moving ahead with their plans to shift the blame onto those content creators for all of the targeted advertising at children that YouTube has been doing for the last 6 years. How exactly does that work anyway? Because I don't get to choose what advertising gets run on my videos. All I get to choose is whether or not advertising is run on my videos. I don't pick the adverts. I don't pick the target audience. That's all done by YouTube. Explain to me how that's my fault. Because whatever chain of logic our glorious corporate overlords have concocted to shift the blame for that one onto me, it's just too complicated for me to follow. That must be it. I'm just too stupid to understand the legal complications. I should probably just shut up and trust YouTube to look after me. I mean, I'm sure they have my best interests at heart, and it's not like they've ever thrown me under the bus before. except for all those other occasions when they've thrown me under the bus before. In other news this week, last Thursday I took part in the weekly English language World of Warships official live stream, where we gave away a whole bunch of things, including some Royal Navy officers' hats, signed by myself, and announced the introduction of the upcoming Pan-European destroyer line in World of Warships. And naturally, all of the Poles, Norwegians, Danes, Belgians, Portuguese, Spaniards, Romanians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Czechs and Croatians got very excited until they saw the actual list of ships that are planned to be released, and then all got a little bit pissed off because 90% of them are Swedish. Now, I'm sure the Swedes were pretty happy. Everybody else, not so much. So why the Swedish bias in a pan-European destroyer line, especially considering that the two existing pan-European premium destroyers in the game are not Swedish? One's Polish and one's Dutch. So what do you suppose the reason for this is? Well, I have a theory. And it is just a theory. I haven't heard anybody from Wargaming confirm or deny it, because this is the first time I have voiced the theory, so you're hearing it at the same time as they do. And the theory is this. Building warships isn't simple, and it's certainly not cheap. Just because a nation has a large merchant fleet or a large fishing fleet doesn't mean that they're capable of or can even afford to build a large war fleet or even a small war fleet. Even in the days of the Age of Sail, where it was a lot more simple to build a war fleet, even large countries didn't have the technical know-how. Peter the Great, for example, spent several years working as a labourer, believe it or not, along with several members of his Imperial Russian court at the Chatham Royal Dockyards, in order to learn the exact processes required to build a modern war fleet, which he promptly did when he returned to Russia. And things got more complicated and more expensive when we moved from wooden sailing ships to iron sailing ships to ironclad steamships to steel armoured and turbine-powered warships. With each revolutionary shift in warship design, the costs, technical know-how and infrastructure required to construct warships rose exponentially. A lot of these smaller European nations did have shipbuilding industries, and still do. But there's a big difference between a shipbuilding industry that's churning out merchantmen and fishing trawlers, and a warship building industry that's churning out battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers and frigates. Not many European nations actually needed to build warships on any kind of great scale, and the ones that did are pretty much already represented in World of Warships anyway. Britain, Germany, France and Italy. Britain in particular needed a large navy to protect its global empire, and the wealth generated by that global empire provided the resources that Britain needed to build the navy that it needed to defend the empire. Germany needed a large navy because fuck the British, which incidentally was the same reason that France needed a large navy. And these were the reason why the British had a navy that was bigger than both the French and German navies combined. Italy didn't actually need a large navy, and it certainly couldn't afford to run a large navy, but they built one and ran one anyway, even though it bankrupted them, mostly just because it guaranteed them membership of the Cool Kids gang. Actually, that's not fair to Italy. Italy was one of a select few nations in the world in that they had the ability to build battleships. And they did build battleships, and they were very good battleships. And having that ability, aside from just being an immense source of national prestige, was also incredibly valuable. Because there were very few nations in the world that were capable of building something as fiendishly expensive and technical as a battleship. In fact, there weren't that many nations in the world that were capable of building something as technical and expensive as a cruiser or a destroyer. Certainly not good ones anyway. It was entirely within the capabilities of most of the world's shipbuilding nations to add a couple of 6-pounder guns to a fishing trawler, for example. And that kind of ship definitely had its place. But dedicated, purpose-built warships were really only capable of being built by a handful, select few nations, and Italy was one of them. And that kind of expertise was incredibly lucrative, because even if you couldn't really afford to be running a large war fleet of these kind of ships yourself, you had to keep building them so that you retained the knowledge. Because building warships, like operating warships, is a perishable skill. If you don't exercise that skill regularly, you will forget how to do it within a generation or less. So having a war fleet of their own, having a couple of these big impressive battleships, essentially as display pieces, shop window items, kept the orders coming in for the Italian shipbuilding industry. Italy, along with France, Britain and Germany, was one of the few nations in the world, let alone Europe, who had the infrastructure, the shipyards with dry docks and berths big enough to actually build the kind of warships that people wanted to buy, who had the steel making and armour plate making industries that were going to actually construct the warships in these dry docks that people wanted to buy, the capability of building the kind of gun barrels and turrets that were going to go into the warships that people wanted to buy, and all of the electrical and mechanical engineering knowledge that went into it as well. In Europe, that was mostly Britain, France, Germany and Italy. But when it came to international orders for warships, nations like Turkey, Brazil and Japan, for example, France, Italy and Germany tended to get the scraps from the British table because everybody wanted the best, certainly if they could afford it. And Britain was seen as being the best because Britain was the biggest. It wasn't necessarily the case that British designs were better than anybody else's. In many cases they weren't. And in many cases the kind of ships that Britain was focused on building, battleships and light cruisers, were either too expensive for most other nations in the case of battleships, or just inappropriate for other nations in the case of light cruisers. Light cruisers are absolutely fantastic for protecting global shipping empires. But if all you really need to do is protect your coastline, even something as modest as a light cruiser is a bit of overkill. A lot of nations would buy British light cruisers to use as the flagships for their fleets. Fleets which mostly consisted of converted fishing boats armed with a couple of 6-pounder guns, and British, French, German and Italian destroyers. The European nations that couldn't afford or didn't have the infrastructure to build their own war fleets were entirely happy just buying them from those who could. And every now and then they might decide to blow the annual budget on a British battleship whenever they were possessed by the sudden urge to show off to their neighbours. Hang on a minute, Jingles. Aren't you forgetting the Austro-Hungarian Empire? They had a fairly sizable navy. They built their own battleships. They did, yes. After the construction of HMS Dreadnought, the Austro-Hungarians thought, bloody hell, that's quite impressive. Can we have some of those ourselves? And they built 4, and one of them is in World of Warships, the SMS Viribus Unitus, a Tier 5 Austro-Hungarian Dreadnought battleship. I'm not sure what it's doing at Tier 5, considering it's a Dreadnought battleship, but it is in the game. That's kind of the problem, though. As a serious military power, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was basically finished by the end of the First World War. Well, okay, so they built a whole bunch of pre-dreadnoughts and then 4 dreadnoughts. What about their destroyers? Okay, in the time period covered by World of Warships, the Austro-Hungarian Navy did field 3 distinct classes of destroyers. There was the Hussar class, which was a British design. There was the Tatra class, which is actually the Tier 2 Pan-European destroyer, and did exist, and was built by the Austro-Hungarian Navy. The Tatra class was succeeded by the Ersatz Triglav class. The problem is that they were shit. They were built not because they were better than the Tatra class, but because they were cheaper than the Tatra class. They had less weapons, and since the Tatra is Tier 2, and the Tier 1 in the Pan-European line is already taken by a Polish destroyer, there's just nowhere to put them. So that's it for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, what about the Dutch? I mean, Britain, France, Germany and Italy weren't the only European nations with a colonial empire to protect at the beginning of the 20th century. No, you're absolutely correct. The Dutch did indeed have a colonial empire. It wasn't as big as the British Empire, but it was certainly as far-flung. And the Dutch built light cruisers to protect and patrol their empire. For example, the Java class of heavy cruisers, 3 of which were planned, 2 of which were built, Java and Sumatra. At the time of their design, and they were a German design by the way, even though they were built in the Netherlands, they were fast, and had a fairly powerful armament, and easily the match for the Chikama class of scout cruisers of the Japanese Navy that they were designed to counter. The problem is that halfway through construction the First World War happened, and by the time the Java and Sumatra were complete, 1920 and I think 1926, they were shit. They were completely obsolete. Well, I say they were completely obsolete, they were still perfectly adequate ships for patrolling the Dutch East Indies, as long as nobody with a modern navy, like the Japanese, tried to invade. Oh wait, that happened. The first light cruiser that was actually designed and built in the Netherlands would have been Hnlms De Ruyter. She was the only ship of her class because it's all that the Netherlands could afford at the time, because she was designed and built during the Great Depression, a time when the Netherlands, along with most other countries in the world, didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, and this showed in her design. During her construction, every effort was made to cut costs, which led to her being undergunned, under-armoured, with severely suspect anti-aircraft protection, although she did have an excellent fire control system. Although none of this helped her when she, along with most of the ABDA, or Australian, British, Dutch and American task force, was obliterated in an encounter with a pair of Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyer escorts in the Battle of the Bali Sea. Of course, in the middle of the 1930s, the Dutch, like anybody else with an empire in the Far East, was keenly aware of the ambitions of the Japanese Empire. And so they did embark on a program to produce successors to the Java and De Ruyter class cruisers. These were the De Zeven Provinciën class cruisers, or 7 provinces. Unfortunately, their construction was interrupted by World War II. Yeah, you kind of missed the boat on that one, really, didn't you, Netherlands? The Germans captured both ships midway through construction. Well, I say midway. The Dutch had barely started, although the lead ship was more advanced in its construction than the others, so the Germans attempted to get it finished, but competing resources and sabotage by the Dutch resistance ensured that neither of the ships was complete by the end of World War II. Alright, that's enough about cruisers, Jingles. What about Dutch destroyers? Well, you do already have a Dutch destroyer in World of Warships. The Friesland, Tier 9. It's an excellent ship. But what about other candidates elsewhere in the tech tree? Well, during World War I, the Dutch did build a series of Wolf-class destroyers. Problem is, they were British designs. They were succeeded in the 1920s by the Admiral-class destroyers. And guess what? British designs. All built in the Netherlands, and all fought during World War II. They were decent ships based on a British prototype, HMS Ambuscade. All of them were lost during World War II. The Admiral class was succeeded by the Gerard Kallenberg class destroyers. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. These were technically Dutch modifications of a British design, HMS Ambuscade. They were upgraded versions of the Admiral class destroyers. Construction of these ships was also interrupted by World War II. 4 were planned, but only 2 were ever completed. One was demolished on the slipway in order to avoid being captured by the Germans. 2 were launched and scuttled in order to avoid them being captured by the Germans. Although both were raised, only one was able to be salvaged and was finished by the Germans and entered German service as the destroyer ZH-1. The last of the 4 ships, the Hnlms Isaac Sweers, wasn't able to actually sail under its own power, but was able to be launched and was towed to Britain by the Dutch tug Black Sea, where it was completed using British guns and British fire control at the Vosper Thornycroft yards. Upon completion, she was manned by the Dutch Navy in exile, and for the next year performed some extremely valuable service, including but not limited to Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, as well as several Mediterranean convoy escorts, during one of which the British destroyer HMS Gurkha was torpedoed by a German U-boat, and Isaac Sweers took her under tow, pulling her through a field of burning oil and taking her all the way back to Tobruk and saving the lives of the entire crew of 240 sailors. Unfortunately for the Isaac Sweers, during Operation Torch in November 1942, shortly after rescuing 240 men from the Dutch Army transport New Zealand that had been torpedoed by a U-boat, Isaac Sweers was herself hit by 2 torpedoes and sunk by the U-431. The final class of Royal Netherlands Navy destroyers that are applicable to the period covered by World of Warships would have been the Van Galen or Van Galen, I really have no idea how to pronounce them, I'm sorry, class of destroyers. There were 2 of them, but they were neither built nor designed by the Dutch. They were in fact Royal Navy N class destroyers. There were 2 of them, both given to the Royal Netherlands Navy in exile to be operated by Dutch crews in 1942 during World War II. Both of them survived the war, and one of them is already in the game, because in 1951, once the Dutch were finished with it, they sold it to Indonesia. It's the Pan-Asian Tier 7 destroyer, the Gajah Mada. Post-World War II, the Dutch just didn't build destroyers. They built the occasional frigate, mine layer, minesweeper, patrol ship, but no destroyers. They operated plenty of destroyers. British destroyers, S, T and Q class, but they just didn't design or build their own. Not until the 1950s. The first major warships built by and for the Dutch after World War II were the Holland class of destroyers. But I'm pretty sure that we'll never see them in World of Warships because they're almost exactly the same as the Friesland, which already exists as a Tier 9 premium. The Holland class were destroyers that didn't have any torpedoes, with 2 gun turrets, 1 at the front, 1 at the rear, each turret holding 2 120mm Bofors guns with a very high rate of fire. There were other differences. Aside from the obvious, electronics on the Friesland would have been more advanced than on the earlier Holland, but the Holland didn't have as many anti-aircraft guns, and it was also about 4 knots slower, so the Holland would basically just be a slightly shit version of the Friesland. So, as far as Dutch destroyers and World of Warships are concerned, unless you're prepared to have a whole bunch of copies of British designs or slightly inferior versions of ships that already exist, there's not really a lot you can do with the Dutch Navy. It's the same with other nations. Spain, Bustamante class, British designed. Alcedo class, British designed. Churruca class, British design. Churruca 2 class, guess what? British design. Things, however, do get a lot more interesting. Interesting? Forgotten how to speak English. Okay, calm down. Things do get a lot more interesting with the Aquila class of Spanish destroyers. Now, if you think Aquila doesn't sound particularly Spanish, you're absolutely right. They were designed by the Italians and built by the Italians to a Romanian specification as part of the Romanian naval expansion program of 1912. However, in 1915, when Italy entered World War I, they turned to Romania and said, no, you can't have them. After the First World War, construction was complete, and they decided that, well, since you've paid for them, Romania, you can have them after all. Of the 4 that were built and saw service in Romania, 2 were sold to Franco's fascist Spanish government in 1937, I think. Although, to conceal the fact that Italy was selling warships to the fascists, they had to disguise them by adding extra funnels and changing their names. They were used quite heavily by the Spanish. And the other 2 that remained in service with Romania were the biggest and most heavily armed warships in the Black Sea during World War II. Unusually for destroyers, they were armed with 152mm guns. The story of these ships got even more complicated in 1944 when Romania surrendered, and the 2 destroyers were taken into service by Russia as part of Russia's Black Sea fleet, although only for a year. In 1945 they were returned to Romania, because Romania was now a communist nation and a member of the Warsaw Pact. These ships might actually make a very unique and interesting addition to the game, because they were designed as destroyers, built as destroyers, and commissioned as destroyers, but they were armed with 3 152mm guns and a secondary battery of 4 76mm guns. And that sounds a bit more like a cruiser. The problem is that if they were to be introduced into World of Warships, who would claim them? Because Italy, Spain, Romania and Russia at one point all operated these ships. As far as any further Spanish destroyer designs are concerned after this, it gets kind of difficult. There was the Ordaz class, but they were a French design. The problem there is that while they were built in Spain, Spain kind of ran out of money halfway through. They managed to complete construction with American military aid, but since Spain was now a member of NATO, Their naval responsibilities were more anti-submarine than anti-surface warfare, so the design of the ships changed. They only had 3 105mm guns, which would be pretty poor for a Tier 3 destroyer. They did have torpedoes, but they were anti-submarine torpedoes, so small caliber, not much of a punch, and they would have been short-ranged by surface warfare torpedo standards. In effect, they were really frigates rather than destroyers. And after this, the Spanish Navy basically just operated Fletchers and Gearings. Pretty much everywhere else that you look in Europe, with 2 exceptions, if you had a navy and you weren't German, French or Italian, that navy was at the very least built for you by the British, and was also very probably designed for you by the British. And those 2 exceptions are Finland, although Finland never had any destroyers, but they did have a lot of gunboats that they designed themselves, and they also had some very interesting coastal defence ships that they built for themselves. But those fall outside the scope of this topic, because they were seriously big ships with some seriously big guns. They were never intended to go very far, but since they were coastal defence ships, they didn't need to. And the other exception, of course, is Sweden, because Sweden has never relied on anybody else for the defence of its own country. They build their own tanks, their own guns, their own artillery, their own aircraft, and their own ships. So if you're looking at a pan-European destroyer tech tree, and you don't want that tech tree to basically be a carbon copy of the Pan-Asian tech tree, which mostly consists of stuff designed and built by either America or Britain, most of it is probably going to end up being Swedish. There are going to be exceptions, of course. I mean, I've mentioned a couple, but I'm sure that many European nations that run a navy at some point will have designed and built ships of their own that may yet make it into World of Warships, perhaps as a premium further down the line. And there are some exceptions that run counter to the way that you might expect things to have developed, like HMS Arno, for example, a unique class of British World War I destroyer, and she was unique because she was designed and built in Italy for Portugal, and when Portugal couldn't afford to pay for her, we did. There are other examples out there of unique European ships that I think would make fantastic additions to the game, possibly as premiums. For example, the Portuguese cruiser Vasco da Gama, which was built in the 18th century but saw service in the Portuguese Navy, mostly as its flagship, until 1935. She's an old ship. She was built in 1878 as an ironclad, but she was refitted in 1901. Her iron hull was stripped and replaced with steel armour. Her engines were removed and she was fitted out with new engines and boilers, which increased her speed to the dizzying rate of 15.5 knots. Her original armament, and I'm not making this up, right? Remember, this was an ironclad cruiser built in 1878, and her original armament of 2 10.2-inch guns. That's 260mm guns, alright? That's not much worse than the guns on the Scharnhorst. These guns were taken off and replaced with guns that had a caliber of a mere 200mm, so yeah, 8-inch heavy cruiser guns. Imagine that, a Tier 2 premium, very slow, heavy cruiser, armed with 8-inch guns. I'd buy that, even if it wasn't the first Portuguese ship to be introduced to the game. And I'm sure there are many examples of unique and interesting European designs that aren't British, French, German, Italian, or Swedish that at some point we're going to see in the future. I'd particularly like to see those Finnish coastal defence ships that I mentioned earlier. Finland built 2 of them. They weren't very big, they only displaced 3,900 tons. That's slightly more than half that of the German Tier 5 Königsberg class cruiser. But whereas the Königsberg light cruisers are armed with 150mm guns, the Finnish coastal defence ships, which are like half the size of the Königsbergs, are armed with 254mm guns. 4 of them, 10-inch guns. Bloody hell, Finland, are you compensating for something? So yeah, I think those would be quite cool to see in the game as well. But anyway, I've blabbered on enough. I'm sure you guys all have all kinds of suggestions for things that I've overlooked or missed, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing them in the comments. But that is it for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you all had a great weekend, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.